On this Connect to the Capitol Extra, liquor liability laws claim yet another business in South Carolina. Carolina Western Pub in the Vista of Columbia announced on social media this week that it will be shutting its doors because it can no longer get the $1 million of liability insurance required for it to remain open. The House introduced and passed a liquor liability law in a single day while the Senate debated it for 4 weeks, trying to come up with a plan that would reduce liability requirements and get more insurance companies offering policies again in South Carolina. I'm Dave Wilson. Thanks so much for joining us. This week, the South Carolina Senate took the House version of the liquor liability legislation and did what's called a strike and insert, forcing their version of insurance and tort reform into a debate in the House. The dueling pieces of legislation have been at the center of the legislative action this entire session. And now, with just a few weeks left in this half of the legislative session, will lawmakers come to a compromise that will keep restaurants, bars, and VFWs open for business in this state? Joining us to break down the differences in the bills and what might actually happen is Spartanburg State Senator Josh Kimbrell. Senator, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, good to be with you. Let's be clear what you mean by first half of the legislative session for the audience's clarification. It's the end of the session for the year.
Right.
So you say it's a two-year session, so it'd be the end of it for the year. So
right.
I don't want people to get their hopes up saying that it's halfway through for the year. It's the end of the year. So if we don't do something now, that means it's another year that bad things happen. And this is what I've been trying to tell folks. This kind of standoff is not helpful for anybody. Something's got to be done one way or the other, and a standoff between the House and Senate doesn't serve anybody well.
So when you take a look at these two pieces of legislation that are out there right now, the House basically said, we're going to address just liquor liability,
sure,
trying to reduce the amount of liquor liability requirements, because right now it's $1 million of a policy that you have to have. But we've got a dwindling number of insurance companies that are willing to write policies in South Carolina. The Senate took 4 weeks to work through this. What is
5, I think, but yeah, I was there for it. It was pretty rough.
It was a pretty rough time. When you look through that, you took a more comprehensive look at this. What's the difference between these two bills, and what do you think is actually going to be happening once it gets over to the House?
Well, the Senate bill is not just a liquor liability bill. I mean, the Senate bill was an all-encompassing tort reform bill, and there were things in that, you and I talked about it here before. There were things in that bill that I liked. There were things I did not like. I said that I repeatedly said throughout this session I was not a senator for all nines or all state. I tried to make that clear. The two competing sides in the Senate bill were either it went too far in the sense it was a handout to insurance companies, or it was going to be too much in favor of like some of there were bad actors on both sides. You got some trial lawyers that go too far, and some that are really good doing the right job, doing a good job, right? Not all trial lawyers are made equal. You've got the people who are predatory trial lawyers, and you've got the predatory insurance companies. I didn't want to go too far either way. I thought that the bill was too all-encompassing, but it did some good things. So it wasn't just a tort reform bill that would have helped with liquor liability. It was going to do a whole range of things, from medical malpractice reform to certain things to help small businesses. But then there were things in it that I thought would really hurt small businesses and be a giveaway to insurance companies. That's why it took so long. Folks like me fought to make sure it was more balanced and not being a giveaway to insurance companies while we tried to help small businesses in liquor liability. The House is more of a rifled approach just to liquor liability. I voted with a number of colleagues to say, all right, if we can't get a full-blown tort reform package that has some compromise to it, that a lot of us tried to force that compromise. And we did end up passing a compromise version of 244 that ended up passing the Senate. That's went over to the House. The House hasn't moved on that. The House had sent us a liquor liability bill that hasn't passed there, hence the standoff you refer to. I did vote, though, to advance the liquor liability bill in the Senate as well. The problem you've got in the Senate, some folks don't want to take up the House bill. In the House, some people don't want to take up the Senate bill. My attitude is, I don't really care if it's the House bill or Senate bill. Let's do something so you don't continue to have business failures like you saw this week here.
Right, and that's the big issue that is really hurting small business in South Carolina. When you have to carry $1 million liability policy, right, and you then have to keep your business open. We saw in the story with CWP here in Columbia, their insurance rates went astronomically higher, more than 3 times what they were. And that has been one of those things that forces business owners to say, can I even remain in business when I'm having to pay 3 times what I was paying for insurance?
Well, the compromise in the Senate would have brought it down to about half of that in most cases. The actual exposure to the insurance company would be around $500,000. The House bill steps it down to you can get to about $250,000. Either one of those is a vast improvement over the $1 million right now. So my hope is now that the Senate We did the strike and insert and sent the compromise version of 244 back to the House. Maybe it's probably going to go to conference committee between the House and the Senate. There'll be conferees appointed from several members of the Senate, several members of the House to debate that. Let's just hope people don't get crazy and try to go for the kitchen sink again. And let's get a rifled approach that's going to deal with this liquor liability crisis. That's what I hope. At some point, people need to realize it's not a Christmas wish list. Let's go for a targeted approach that's going to give relief to bars and restaurants particularly. That's where the really acute crisis is. That's where the real problem is. All this other stuff that's still out there needs to be debated. I understand there's other things people want to talk about. We're down to about 9-10 legislative days left, and we have the budget still to pass. We need to do something to make sure we don't continue to have bars and restaurants like CWP close. And that means let's get very laser focused on the liquor liability piece and see if we can do that before we adjourn.
So let's talk about the calendar real quick, because May 8th is the end of this half of the entire 2-year legislative session.
So for all intents and purposes, as South Carolinians understand it, that is the end of session for the year.
Right. And so when that happens, that bill can still carry over into next year, but we're then going to see...
You're talking January of 2026.
Right,
yeah.
Which means that we're going to have an entire rest of this year where no changes would go on if there's no compromise reached on this. That could seriously impact more businesses, especially as we get into the second half of the year.
Yeah, what I had seen up until, I guess, the first of this year is we had experienced roughly 5,400, 5,500 bars, restaurants, kind of hospitality businesses close because of the crisis surrounding liquor liability insurance. I would expect that number would significantly increase again between now and the end of the year, and that's tragic. That shouldn't happen, especially given all the attention on it. So my hope is, and I'm certainly going to be advocating for this, is let's don't leave May 8th without something being done. I think a lot of us understand that. I certainly do. I'm pretty loud about it. I'm not the only one. A lot of us recognize the liquor liability crisis is very real and present. And I think it was exacerbated this week here in Columbia, just down the street from the Capitol with the closure of CWP. So I really am still optimistic with these remaining days of session that we will do something. Obviously next week's out because of the budget that'll dominate the Senate. But we've sent a bill back to the House. I'm hopeful that this leads to at least a conference committee. And maybe the conferees can meet and hammer something out so we can vote on something before we adjourn May 8th.
When you look at a conference committee, you're going to have, if the House does not concur, which we seriously doubt that they will. I doubt
they're going to, right, yeah.
Then what's going to end up happening is it'll come back over and you'll have to have 3 conferees on both sides.
Right, 3 House members, 3 senators, yep.
And those 6 people will then work together on trying to come up with some level of a compromise bill to send back to both chambers. Do you think that there's some level of common ground that's going to be met between these 2 chambers before we get to May 8th?
Look, I think the common ground is we know that the liquor liability issue needs to be handled. Everything else is kind of secondary to that. So I think the common ground is that. So yeah, I hope so. I hope that, I believe that everybody understands that the liquor liability is the real pinch point. The $1 million limits are simply not the people aren't getting covered. So it's not just that the premiums are skyrocketing, which that certainly is happening. It's that insurance coverage isn't even available in many cases. It's really sad to watch people lose their dreams because they can't get coverage. And we may have to see, one thing I tried to do last year was just suspend the coverage requirement. So you may see a renewed effort among some of us in the budget next week to just suspend the requirement. I'm willing to try. I mean, look, I tried it last year. So that didn't pass last year, and I know that leads to certain other potential problems, but we cannot have another 1,000, 2,000 business failures because of it.
When you look at that, CWP actually put out in their social media post that they can no longer get insurance coverage.
That's what I'm saying. What I mean is you can't have a mandate that can't be met. So a number of us tried to suspend the requirement last year. I don't think that's the best policy, okay? But if you can't get coverage and the law requires you to have it to stay in business, you're putting people in an impossible pinch. I hope that cooler heads prevail and we get a liquor liability piece out of this. That's what I want. If not, we may have to study waiving the requirement to have that coverage for a year until we can get a compromise. I cannot in good conscience have a person lose their business because the legislature is dithering over here while Rome burns. I mean, that's what's happening. You got people who just dug in on their positions. And look, I have deeply held positions too, but at some point you can't just say, to hell with it, it's my way or the highway, I'm gonna let Rome burn here. Can't do that. So I think a lot of us are going to be looking at options to try to prevent future closures here and more people lose their businesses over a mandate we've put in place as a legislature, not me personally, but that the legislature's put in place that can't even be met because of market conditions. So we've got to do something.
So one of the things that has been behind this move has been the fact that South Carolina has one of the higher DUI rates in America.
Sure.
And what else is being done? Has that been interjected into this discussion, or are you looking at doing something with that separately?
Well, we've been looking at DUI separate. I mean, you can't tie that to the reform bill because liquor liability reform and DUI are separate code sections, and under these rules, you can't have multiple code sections addressed with that. So, you know, we are looking at DUI reform. Yes, absolutely. I've been on that subcommittee all year. We've had hours and hours of testimony, huge amounts of debate. We are looking at addressing DUI reform, and that's certainly going to happen. I don't think we'll get that done before this year is over, just because it's extraordinarily complicated. I think you'll see that happen next year, in the second year of the 2-year session. That's a huge overhaul. I think that's going to happen. I support substantial DUI reform, but even that's not by itself enough. I mean, it's a conjoined twin of bad things. It's DUI laws that need to be updated to bring down the death rate. It needs to be that we don't put this artificial $1 million limit out there on small businesses and bars. And there's a number of things that need to happen. It's been years in the making. It's going to take a while to unwind this bad apple. But something needs to happen on liquor liability. It needs to happen before May 8th. If not, we're going to need to start studying how do we suspend the requirement for a year.
Is there a process for you to be able to do that within the budget? How would that even work if you could even do that?
Well, we'd have to study. We're looking at it. I mean, we tried it last year. You have to be careful about suspending permanent law through the budget, right? But theoretically, you could look at a hiatus on the requirement, enforcing it, right? So you can't change the law permanently saying we're going to suspend the requirement, period. I'm looking at what could we do to suspend the enforcement of basically law enforcement going in and saying, all right, if you don't have insurance, we're shutting you down. I think you have to look at, can you just basically say we're not enforcing that for a year while we try to figure out how to deal with the insurance crisis? I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's a Hail Mary pass.
Exactly. Senator Josh Kimbrell, thanks so much for being
Thank
a
you.
part of
Thank
today's
you.
Connect to the
Thank
Capitol
you.
Extra. This is legislation that's hitting close to home for many people, and we'll keep you updated as the banter goes back and forth between the chambers at the South Carolina State House as we keep you connected to the Capitol.
Thank you.